Hello, everybody. This is Tosca at NGO Soul and Strategy. Today, I'm going to have an interview with Professor Aseem Prakash at the University of Washington. So let me first tell you a little bit about Aseem's work and how I met him. So in my former professional life, after I had been an international development practitioner for about 16 years or so, I became an accidental academic at Syracuse University. And during that stage, I met Aseem at several conferences, and he is most surely an influential scholar in the field of INGO studies here in the US, as well as abroad. Aseem then asked me in 2018-19 to write a piece in a special volume that came out in nonprofit policy form that became my essay, Can Organizational Culture Help Explain Recent INGO Scandals? Because it was devoted to the kind of last 5 years or so of repeated scandals that NGOs have gone through, and really enjoyed that collaboration. And then most recently, my ears perked up when I read an article that Aseem wrote together with Nives Dolsak, professor as well as director of the School of Marine and Environmental Affairs at University of Washington in Seattle, USA. And that article is about the virtue narrative. And I've been sensing for a while now that this virtue narrative as attached to INGOs can cause some real problems, which may well go well beyond the scandals on sexual abuse, abuse of power, etc. So in this in this interview, we are talking about that particular article. And I may occasionally offer you a quote from the article. So let me start saying, Aseem, welcome.
Thank you, Tosca. Thank you for having me over.
You're so welcome. I'm looking forward to it. So, dear listeners, let me give you a quick bio on Aseem. He is a professor at the University of Washington in Seattle. As I said, he founded the Center on Environmental Politics. He also works at the Department of Political Science and the School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University. Aseem writes extensively on environmental policy, climate governance, NGO and nonprofits, and on voluntary sector regulation, and we may touch upon that. With regard to his research on NGOs, he looks at NGOs' accountability, their regulation, and their self-regulation efforts, as well as their governance and the governance systems in which they have to fit. He's a contributor to Forbes.com. He writes for The Conversation, Huffington Post, The Hill, The Washington Post. So here's a real public intellectual at work. Interestingly for me, Aseem started his career in brand management at Procter & Gamble company in Mumbai. I thought that was really interesting. And he obtained also his MBA from the famous Indian Institute of Management in Ahmedabad in India. So Aseem, let's jump into your article on the virtue narrative and some reasons why you and Nivek are arguing that could lead to some what you call NGO failures. But before we go there, tell us a little bit, tell our audience a little bit about the kind of research arc of NGO-related topics that you're interested in.
Yeah, thank you, Tosca. I think the big concern all of us have is there is a widespread institutional failure and people are losing faith in institutions. So there are obviously market failures, there are obviously governmental failures, and what we suggest is that even the NGOs are failing on some counts. And this is not surprising because at the end of the day, whether it's governments, it's markets, whether it's NGOs, these are creations of human beings.
Yeah.
So we make rules, we establish organizations, hoping to do good, but sometimes we feel, so as scholars, as practitioners who want a better world for everybody, I think it's important to study failures in different kinds of organizations, different kinds of institutions, with the objective to reform them. So the key issue is that if we talk about NGO failures, we're not saying all NGOs are bad, no.
Right.
Or if we talk about government failure, we're not saying all governments are bad, no. I think every institution has its pros and cons, and the task for us is to identify how can we make them do better.
I see. I love how you explained that in a very concise way and clear way. So when you, Aseem, use the word virtue narrative attached to NGOs, what are we talking about that?
If one goes back to the writings, the discussions after the Cold War, after the Berlin Wall fell, people declared, especially Lester Salmon and others, that we have an associational revolution, and he was right. Mm-hmm. Because absence of state coercion, people wanted to express themselves, they wanted to solve their own problems, and there was a resurgence in civil society. And a lot of scholars that started writing wanted to contrast civil society from states and markets. And the arguments they made was that civil society is somehow different. And one way they contended it was different is that unlike firms that are greedy, that are kind of motivated by the profit motives, NGOs are guided by virtue. They're principled actors. Right. And they're always trying to do good. So this is the virtue narrative, that thinking NGOs in an undifferentiated way and putting them in the category of good and putting firms and states in the category of bad. I love what you say, thinking about NGOs in an undifferentiated way in the category of good. So in the article, and we're going to attach a copy of the article to the show notes, so you can find them there. You talk about, if I can quote for a moment, when virtue conditions are violated, NGOs could exhibit different levels of failure. And what I'd like to do in this discussion, Aseem, is talk to you one by one about these different forms of failures and how they could. And so I'll list them for a moment, and then I'll have you explain them one by one. So there is agency failure, NGOization failure. I think a lot of practitioners can relate to that. Representation failure, same story, and cooperation failure. So let's look at those, as I said, one by one. So when we talk about, just get to that. When we talk about that first example of agency failure, tell us more what that is about. What do we mean by agency here? Right. So when we think of governments, Lincoln had said, of the people, for the people, by the people. Mm-hmm. And the idea was that the government works on behalf of people. Government is an agent of people. Mm-hmm. Similarly, if one thinks of firms, one thinks about firms working in behalf of shareholders, as per Milton Friedman, or if you take a more expansive view, working on behalf of stakeholders. So organizations, whether it's governments, whether it's firms, or whether it's NGOs, work on behalf of somebody. Mm-hmm. So first task is to identify who's this somebody. Yeah. So if we look deeply about NGOs and the nonprofit sector, the claim since the time of Alex C.D. Tocqueville is that these are community-based efforts. These are local grassroots efforts where people come together to solve local problems collaboratively. And we may create organizations as the modern NGO sector is, but these organizations eventually have to be rooted in the community. The people in the communities they serve are the principals, and NGOs are their agents. So then the issue is, if an agent does not perform as per the expectations and preference of the community, we have a problem. This is called an agency failure. Okay, so this is kind of juxtaposing principles and agents. So the agent has to serve the principle, and if in the case of NGOs, if the NGO is the agent, but the principle is not community members, although we need to unpack that, of course, too, as you say in the article, but instead they serve other principles, then that could lead to failure. Tell us more about what these other principles then can be. Correct. So let's start with a very simple example. A large number of NGOs do not get the resources from the communities they serve. They get from donors, they get from foundations, and a lot of them actually get from the government. Mm-hmm. So if one looks deeply as to why does the agent become responsive to the concerns of the principals, The reason is because the agent depends on the principles for resources and legitimacy. Politicians listen to voters because they want to get re-elected. The managers in firms listen to shareholders, otherwise they'll be kicked out. In the NGO sector, we have a problem because the actors who are providing critical resources are not the communities that are being served by the NGOs, though they should be, but in reality, they're not. As a result, NGOs start performing as per the expectations, as per the preferences of the donors, as opposed to communities. And oftentimes, donors, which are often residing in rich urban areas, have very different lived experiences, do not share the same kinds of preferences as the communities that the NGOs are expected to serve.
And that I found really interesting in your article. And also it's something that I've often talked about that both the staff, and we'll get to this when we talk about NGOization, but that both the staff and the board members of NGOs and their supporters, as you say, are a certain slice of society from a class and from a urban perspective, education, etc. Not unless we're talking about organizations that are directly representing the people who whose interests they promote, not the people that they are purporting to believe. And that's, I think, what you're talking about, right?
Exactly. And the problem gets compounded because donors have a particular theory of change. They think this is how their money will bring about social change. But this may be at variance with how the local people, the people who are the beneficiaries that we call, think about social change. So think of an NGO that's serving refugees in a camp, people who are desperate, who are destitute. They really have got no power or leverage against or in relation to the NGOs. And NGOs need regular funding from the donors to serve these refugees. So in some ways, the principles, which are the refugees, which are the communities that the NGOs are supposed to serve, are quite powerless. So it's the resource,
And do you, as you know, Aseem, we've had at least a generation or so of efforts within the NGO sector to bring beneficiary voice, as we used to call it, constituency voice, as it's sometimes called now, because the term beneficiary is more and more disliked. Forms of participatory program planning, implementation, evaluation, all those forms of representation of community members directly, in your mind, have not resulted in a significant balancing of this agency failure?
No, they may. The reality is always more nuanced. And I think one will have to look at specific organizations, specific contexts. Some NGOs have probably done better than others. So I think we have to be very careful not to have a blanket assessment. I think first of all these steps are welcome. If NGOs are reaching out and trying to serve their constituents better, I think everybody should welcome it. I see no wrong in it. Can it be made better? Absolutely. Everything can be made better. Governments can function better, firms can function better, and NGOs can function better.
As you said.
I think the critical issue is to reflect, how do NGOs decide how the constituents would be represented? Through what processes, through what mechanisms are they understanding the preferences of their communities? What are the best practices? And can we do better? I think that's the question all of us have to ask time and over again. Can we do better?
And then also maybe the question of when those voices have been collected and articulated, how are they weighed?
Exactly.
Weighted,
how they acted on.
Of other stakeholders, because as we know from both the research on NGOs and the practice, that NGOs typically have a multitude of stakeholders, right? But let's go to the second form of failure in your argument, NGOization failure. What is that about?
I think that's a term a lot of people are using these days. NGOization is when the civil society sector, which is supposed to be grassrooted, becomes professionalized, is guided by managerialism. And the leaders of the NGOs are chasing one grant over another. They're urban-based. Their focus is on appeasing the donors, on hosting events in important hotels, and essentially become very, very managerialistic. They become part of what we have called the global charity chains. It's a big
Global
supply charity
chains.
chain. So Ronald Berger, Trudy Owen, and I wrote an article on global charity chains. And essentially, it's like the supply chain of multinational corporations. That, something is produced or sold in America or Europe, but it's outsourced down the line to developing countries. So here, the donors are in developed countries. They contact some local NGOs who probably speak English, have an MPA from famous places like Syracuse, and talk the same lingo. So they contact them. These people then kind of subcontract to other people. So there's a whole charity chain.
Yeah.
And this is what managerialism is bringing about. That we are not creating grassroots representatives, we are creating managers of NGOs.
Yes.
And this leads to NGOization.
I see. In my mind, I wish we could talk about it, but we do not have time. Maybe another time. I, till today, have not been able to make up my mind what I think about this, the right balance between professionalization, or the extent to which professionalization is welcome and warranted, and the extent to which NGOs are what I sometimes like to call are publicly owned, are really owned in the communities in which they operate. Yeah, maybe we can talk about that another time, you and I. Let's move on to the next failure, which is a representation failure.
Right. So if we look around NGOs and see who they actually represent, who are the people populating NGOs? Mm-hmm. And I'm, take the first stab in terms of, say, gender. Do NGOs that are catering or working on gender issues, do they really have women in the leadership? Or NGOs that are catering to X, Y, or Z, do their leaders have any lived experience, any real life experience to be able to think about these issues in a deeper way? Mm-hmm. And I think this is a problem not only in the NGO sector, but in other sectors as well, that the organizations that are supposed to be serving communities don't reflect and represent that community. Mm-hmm. And I think this is important. And I'm not talking about very basic characteristics. I'm talking about lived experiences. Mm-hmm. Because to generate empathy, to generate meaningful policy interventions, one should be able to relate to that.
Yeah. Let me get to this point that I'm always tussling about in my mind, and I was just referencing. So on the one hand, what you're saying, of course, is totally true. On the other hand, when we look at the size, and you already kind of referenced it, the size of many mid to large size INGOs, both those founded primarily in the global north, as well as those that have been founded in the global south, and in some ways have been on the rise for a number of years. How do you see that perspective of people with lived experience, with community roots, and strong linkages and legitimacy at the community level? How do you see that then combined with some kind of a whole of organizational leadership and management that can provide that overview? It seems hard for the lay person to see how those two things could be combined in very large organizations. Have you seen that in practice?
I think yes and no. So when organizations are recruiting leaders, probably they should give importance to leaders who have had these experiences. Mm-hmm. NGO should offer sabbatical to their leaders and ask them to go back to the communities. Okay. And work at the grassroots as well.
Like in the World Bank. I remember when I worked in the World Bank, which is a long time ago, but there was this program it's kind of sad that it was needed, for immersion of World Bank leaders at the village level in various countries. Is that
we become comfortable too quickly. Mm-hmm. In our routines, and we tend to forget the bigger mission, bigger purpose.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that when organizational level leaders, so leaders with positional power, right, if they go through these types of immersion experience, do you think that that will help them making sure that the voice of the local level is heard in upper levels in organizations, even if those NGOs are not necessarily terribly hierarchical, but still there is some layering of decision making?
I think it would certainly help. A lot depends on how these programs are structured. So if you go and live in a slum, but you have the poshest house with air conditioning and with, all kinds of fancy creature comforts, then obviously it's not the real world experience.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, you must have seen recent articles that when United Nations teams arrive in a particular city, the first thing that goes up is real estate. And the expensive restaurants start having a boom time.
Yes.
Because UN personnel and NGOs become part of that whole culture, zipping around in Land Rovers and living in fancy houses. This was probably an important reason for the Haiti scandal, that they're having, Oxfam is having parties, poolside parties, or other kinds of parties in fancy bungalows.
Yeah.
And we're inviting, women for, inappropriate behavior.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's important that if we go to a community, if we immerse in a community, we become part of the community, not as somebody who's parachuting in for 2 months and then parachuting out.
Yeah, what you're talking about makes me think back to my experience in Cambodia a long time ago, again with the first large UN peacekeeping operation, and exactly that phenomena, that the whole market for let's call it upskill experiences, etc., that was created as a result of the infusion of the UN apparatus in that country. Well, let's look at that last form of failure, and you call it cooperation failure.
So one of the interesting claims that has been made by scholars and practitioners alike, that NGOs are different from firms because firms are always competing for profits. And NGOs don't have to compete because all of them are trying to serve the humanity. So there's no competition. So this is a testable claim. Is that really so? And unfortunately not. So whenever there's a big project, there's a bid that is invited. And NGOs, rightly or wrongly, become competitors.
Yes.
And we've seen that in several other cases also, when even, in advocacy, NGOs want spotlight. They rather get the spotlight for themselves than because the entry barriers are low. Anybody can establish an NGO.
Yes.
So to make sure that you have a sufficient and substantial presence in that space, whether it's media space or the donor space, NGOs become competitors. And this leads to a cooperation failure, and NGOs start exhibiting sometimes firm-like features of competition, non-collaboration, etc., etc. So it becomes a marketplace. It's not a shared desire to serve humanity and to work together and forget our own personal ambitions, etc., etc. So I think this is the cooperation failure that often contributes to undermining the virtue narrative.
Yeah. And so you're saying these four factors, if we sum them up again, so let me see, we have agency failure, we have NGOization failure, we have collaboration failure, but there was one more.
Representation failure.
Representation failure, right? If these four failures come together, NGOs cannot act on their mission. But more importantly, are you saying, Aseem, that the narrative, the public image of NGOs as virtuous organizations is incongruent with those four sources of failure? Or are you saying that the virtue narrative is actually either perpetuating or otherwise reinforcing those four failures? What is the correlation?
Yeah, I think if one looks at why the virtue narrative fails, we can look at the four drivers of failure. So what are the practical consequences? I think there are two practical consequences. First is, as NGOs or as NGO sector, it is not able to deliver on its mission of serving the humanity. And the good news is that some of these failures can be ameliorated. I'll not say fixed, because no failure can completely go away, but they can be reduced. So towards the end of the paper, we talk about, self-regulatory and other kinds of frameworks, how boards can be made more inclusive, et cetera, where some of these failures kind of are lessened. That's one. Number two, all of us need to sit back and think, why have about 60 countries enacted laws that are restricting NGOs? NGOs, which are supposed to be the holy cow that everybody wanted to, incorporate, to engage with, suddenly they are getting shunned. And it's happening across not only developing world, but also in some developing countries, developed countries as well.
Yeah.
So we have to understand why this sudden change in perception about NGOs. And of course, authoritarian leaders are trying to use this excuse, but I think there's a deeper problem. And the deeper problem is whenever an anti-NGO law is enacted, I don't see people in the streets demanding the law.
Exactly.
So where is the public support?
That is what I meant by this term that I borrowed from Ingrid Srinath, whose work I much appreciate, that public ownership is quite shallow or non-existing.
And again, it varies. Some organizations are more rooted and have more public support than others. But I think for all of us who care deeply about the NGO sector and who want the NGO sector to do well, and to do well, you have to acknowledge the problems and then try to correct them. Glossing over problems is not a recipe for success. I think we have to understand, why is this happening? And how can we fix it? Why do local people, sometimes, not always, think that NGOs are elitist? They have deep pockets. And what kind of impression do we convey when NGO managers live in posh houses in poor neighborhoods, or zip around in Range Rovers, or hold receptions in developing countries in 5-star hotels to discuss poverty? So there is sometimes, not always, there's a kind of incongruity. Or why are NGO leaders zipping off to international conferences? What will these international conferences do for the local people? People who are surviving on $2 a day, you go to an international conference, is this really the best use of the money? And what have you achieved? So I think these issues have to be raised. I don't think there is a final set answer on this, but all of us, the community of people who care about the NGO sector, who want the sector to do well, we have to start asking ourselves these tough questions.
And you say towards the end of the article that governments can kind of weaponize this argument about NGO failure, right? Coming again out of that virtue narrative. Now, you did make brief reference to NGO self-regulatory clubs. And I know that you and Mary Kay Gugerty, your colleague at the University of Washington, have coined that term in another article. Now, what I recall from your argument in that article is that what can NGO self-regulatory clubs be a meaningful solution to part of the problem that you pose in this article on the virtue narrative and NGO failures? To what extent can they, and what are their limitations?
Yes and no. So it's not clubs per se, but what kind of rules do they require of their members? Because the way we have greenwashing for environmental clubs, we can have charity washing, we can have fake clubs. So if NGOs seriously want to self-regulate, they need to establish rules which impose tough conditions on how NGOs operate, how they function, what kind of leadership do they recruit. And this would help them in signaling their intent for self-reform to external stakeholders. People who say NGOs are poorly managed, NGOs don't have oversight, NGOs are corrupt. A well-functioning, a well-designed, tough club would answer these critics and assuage their concerns. Moreover,
that would depend on how much real accountability, as you say, tough clubs, right? And
Correct.
just for our audience, so when Aseem and I are talking about self-regulatory clubs, we are talking about the kind of, for instance, national NGO platforms that have standards, codes of conduct, that have self-reporting, or occasionally have external
Auditors.
right? Yeah. So I guess a lot depends on how quote unquote tough those rules
Correct.
are, right?
Correct. So the way, governments can act laws with a lot of loopholes, Swiss cheese with deep holes, same way NGOs can also create these rules, codes of conducts, which are very shabby and which are very flimsy. And these don't help either the NGOs. In fact, they further undermine NGO legitimacy because people think, well, NGOs are playing the fast one here. So I think there is an opportunity for self-regulation, true, sincere self-regulation. And that can also help us weed out the briefcase NGOs, the fly-by-night operators from the real committed NGOs who are in the sector for a bigger cause.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we need to do.
Yeah. Well, Aseem, we've come to the end of our interview. So let me ask you, if our audience is really intrigued by the argument that we discussed in this interview, and they want to see the article, and they want to know more about your work and your other public work on the environment and climate as well, and climate activism, where should they go?
They should come to my website, aseemprakash.net, or just Google me. And you will find my smiling face and you can click on that.
That's right. And I will make sure that your own website is represented. Your LinkedIn profile, we will add there as well, and we will attach the article. Well, thank you, Aseem, very much for sharing your insights, and thanks you, listeners. If you found this podcast stimulating, then be sure to check out other episodes. You can find those on my website, that is 5 as in the number 5oaksconsulting.org. Also, this podcast episode will appear on my YouTube channel. Subscribe to my email list, and you will always be the first to know when a new episode comes out. Also wanted to just mention that we are soon launching the next cohort in our online course on virtual team leadership. And you can find out more about that at our second website, and that is 5oaks.teachable.com. And trust me, your teams will thank you. This is Tosca, and I look forward to spending time with you on NGO, Soul, and Strategy next time.
Thank you.